Hello everyone and welcome to my Nutrient Nirvana channel. Today, as you can see, I'm joined once again by author, scholar, researcher Ralph Ellis, and today we're going to provide ample evidence for Ralph's Josephus-Saul correlation. So Ralph, how are you today?
Very well, thanks, Paul. Yes, glad to be back on again.
Brilliant. Okay. Ralph, when did you first make this discovery?
Yes, the connection between Saul and Josephus, which is central to my thesis, I have to say. You can't really have this thesis without joining these two characters together. And I saw this almost at the very beginning. Not when I was researching in my youth, I didn't see it then, but I understood, most of the sort of gospel story at that point. But when I started researching for my first book, which was Jesus, Last of the Pharaohs, I had to go through the works of Josephus, which I had not done much before. I knew of the guy. I'd read a few of his passages, but I'd never read his works because, well, they're voluminous, you might say. I mean, they just go on and on. Him and his scribes must have taken forever to write these books. So I started ploughing my way through the works of Josephus and his description of the Jewish revolt. And I just saw almost immediately that there were numerous connections between this Josephus character and Saul. And also that the problem that both of these characters are missing from the historical record. I mean, Saul we know nothing about. Saul, of course, for listeners, is St. Paul, one of the primary apostles, later apostles, according to the story of Jesus. We know nothing about him at all, apart from what the Gospels say. He's completely missing outside that story. And then Josephus, well, we know him very well from his works. So we know he was a real character. That's guaranteed. But outside his works, we don't really have much information on him. We certainly don't have a biography by any other chronicler. And, we have no archaeology that points towards, his life and so on. So these two characters are largely missing from the historical record, apart from their own writings. And reading Josephus, it just struck me immediately that they were very, very similar. And so I started looking through all of the connections between these two characters. And I found point after point that alluded to them being a single character, who I call Saul Josephus, the conflated Saul and Josephus. And, well, perhaps we can go through some of those. They were both Jews, of course. They both came from Judea. They were both raised in Jerusalem. They both had Roman citizenship, and that's important because in that era, not that many people had Roman citizenship. It was a little bit unusual, especially for the Jews. So that puts him in a unique category of just a few, hundreds of people. Cuts down the numbers somewhat, you might say. They were both educated as Pharisees. They both became rabbis. And then we start getting into the elements of the man. They both appear to have had short hair, which is exemplified by the bust that we think is of Josephus. It's not determined that that is Josephus, but that was the view of the people who found that bust. Because of the descriptions of Josephus within his works, that he would have been pro-Roman and clean-shaven, unlike the Jews, who were not pro-Roman and normally very hairy, quite hirsute. The Jews, unlike some of the modern researchers I've been arguing with, an Orthodox Jew would have long hair like they do today. They have long hair, side locks, maybe shaven on the top of the head, but side locks of hair and a long beard. The traditional sort of Orthodox Jew, they would have been hairy. But Saul, here's where we get the similarity. Saul disparages long hair because he is pro-Roman. So he says in 1 Corinthians 11:14, does nature not teach you that long hair is shameful on a man? Now that's unusual for a Jew. That sets him aside to the vast majority of people, Jews within Judea. It puts him alongside the Gentiles as being pro-Roman. So that would have been very unusual for a Jew. And Josephus makes similar comments. We don't have a proper image of Josephus, but he says, he's talking about the Nazarites, the Nazarenes. And he says, when any of them have made a sacred vow, I mean those that are called Nazarites, they suffer their hair to grow long. Now, if Josephus had long hair like a Jew, he wouldn't mention it like that in that respect. They suffer their hair to grow long. Quite obviously, he didn't have long hair in the same fashion as a Nazarite. And we know the Nazarites had long hair because the Old Testament tells us so, that they weren't allowed to cut their hair, except as a sacrifice. They could sacrifice their hair to the temple. So again, similarities between the two. They both had short hair by the looks of it. And then we come on to their life story, and both of them worked with the Jerusalem authorities against the Jewish revolutionaries during the sort of pre-Jewish revolt era, so the AD 60s, pursuing them around Galilee and persecuting and imprisoning their followers. And that's interesting because, well, we'll come on to this later, but under what authority was Saul doing this? We'll come on to that because there's another similarity to be looked at there. Both of them had a flash of inspiration and changed sides. Now, there's a slight difference here because Saul changed sides to the Nazarene, the Church of Jesus and James, whereas Josephus changed sides and went over to the Romans. But they both had this this dramatic event which made them change sides. So they were both traitors to their previous supporters and so on. They both traveled widely in Europe and returned to Jerusalem. Saul obviously had his evangelical tours across Europe, and both Saul and Josephus went to Rome, which we will talk about in a minute. They were both controversial characters. They were both attacked and stoned by their detractors, and they were both called liars, deceitful people, which they both defend themselves against, saying, Saul especially says, I'm not a liar, I lie not. He's continuously defending himself. And they both sailed to Rome on a prison ship, which was shipwrecked on Malta. Well, actually, we don't know the second one, but anyway, they were both on a prison ship for various reasons. Saul was on there because he was defending, supposedly, this is what he says, defending Jewish rabbis from the procurator at that time, I think was Felix, and going to Rome to defend themselves in court, basically, with the emperor. So a pretty important case. If, this case is being raised up to the level of the emperor to decide on this particular case. It was about building, they built a wall outside the governor's palace, outside the king's palace. So the king had it doesn't seem enough reason really to send these people to Rome, really. The king had built a dining room that overlooked the temple platform. And the priesthood didn't like that, so they built a wall in front of his window so he couldn't see. It's called the Temple Wall affair. Anyway, so these priests got sent to Rome. And Saul was being sent as some sort of lawyer to defend them or something of that nature. We're not quite sure. Sorry, am I getting this wrong? That was Josephus. Sorry. Everything I've just said there was about Josephus. You see, these two characters are so intertwined. You get them confused all the time.
Yeah.
Saul was there because he was in jail. And that does correlate because Josephus has a 7-year missing gap in his life at about this time. So Saul had been sent to jail. And it's interesting that Saul was obviously aristocratic and influential, because all of the procurators came to discuss matters with him in jail. Now, Saul was supposed to be a tent maker. So, why do important people, including the king and effectively the queen, so Agrippa II and Berenike, they all came to see Saul in jail and converse with him? Why would you do that to a tent maker? Makes no sense. Why would, was it Felix or Festus? One of the governors was trying to get bribes off Saul in order to let him out of jail. Again, it sort of indicates that he was rich, aristocratic, and influential, because you don't get bribe money from a pauper tent maker, simply. Anyway, so they couldn't decide this case. He was accused of teachings against the religion of Judaism, because Saul was the apostle to the Gentiles, of course. And so they decided in the end to send him to Rome, which I think is a bit odd, because, the emperor would only decide the very most important matters within the empire, not whether some stupid little individual had been preaching something that was against the incomprehensible tenets of Judaism, which Nero would know nothing about. He wasn't a Jew. Why would he know anything about this topic? But anyway, they sent him to go and see Nero. And so they were both on this same prison ship at the same time. This is about AD 62-ish or something of that nature. And they set off to go to Rome, and they go via Cyprus initially. So they take a boat up the Mediterranean towards Cyprus, and then they jump on another boat, which was called Castor and Pollux. So the boat has a name exactly the same as we do today, and they sail down the Mediterranean past Crete, and they get stuck in a storm. And it's a big, huge 3-day storm, although Saul and Josephus always exaggerate, so take that with a pinch of salt. And the ship is wrecked. And it appears that they were wrecked on Malta. So they were saved, and finally they both sail to Naples and go to Rome to see Nero. And they both go to Rome. They both see Nero and plead their case before Nero. Now, how many Jews in AD 62 are on prison ships going to Nero to plead their case with the emperor? I mean, not many people get to plead their case, before the monarch, the king, as it were, of the Roman Empire. It had to be important. The person involved had to be important, and there could only be 1 or 2 people at the very most in the AD 60s who were sent, to Rome to plead their case, which sort of suggests that Saul was Josephus. And that is what I think they were. They were the same. And I love the way that Saul, on the way, he goes from Naples to Rome, and the first thing he does is he stops off at the 3 taverns for a pint. So good for that man on that occasion. I don't like the guy, of course, but I like the way he stops at the 3 taverns. And what else do we have that's similar between these guys? Both were inveterate letter writers. So, and remember, writing letters was the privilege of a very aristocratic and rich few at that time. You can imagine how expensive it was to send a letter across to Greece from Judea or wherever you happen to be. Hugely expensive. And not many people could write anyway, in that sort of era. But they're both writing letters. I mean, Josephus says that he wrote 60 letters commending his works to the people around Rome. And of course, Saul does exactly the same. He writes all of his epistles to all of his followers in all of the cities around Europe. He's writing all the time to these people. So there is that similarity. And both of these people, because they're writing all of these documents and texts and so on, especially Josephus with his, first of all, his Jewish wars, his Bellum. It's a vast book in a way, 18 chapters, I think it is. I mean, it's a vast undertaking. And so he had assistants. And his assistant was Epaphroditus. And the assistant of Saul was Epaphroditus. Now, some people will claim, it's a different guy. But how many scribes and translators were there in that era? We're talking the sort of, for the letters would have been from the AD 60s, and Josephus' works would have been the AD 70s. How many scribes, translators, and publishers at that time were called Epaphroditus? For many reasons, I think that this was the same guy. And the reason he was actually employing Epaphroditus especially was because Josephus didn't speak Greek very well. And so he needed a translator to translate his books into Greek. And okay, so we've established that these two guys are very, very similar. They could be considered to be the same person. And this starts explaining things within the gospel story. And one of them, shall I go with this one first because that is complex? Anyway, well, let's go for it. After the death of Judas, there was an election for a new disciple because they were missing one disciple. And there were two contenders for this position called Joseph Barsabbas and Matthias Barnabas. But the Joseph Barsabbas in some of these texts is called Barnabas. So both of them had the same surname. And you wouldn't get this if you just read the Bible, because, most people are reading the sort of American Standard or the King James Bible, and you wouldn't get this connection. I only get this because I depend quite a lot on people like Adam Clarke, who's a sort of 19th century theologian who does a commentary on the Bible. Now, some researchers disregard the commentaries on these texts, but I find them very valuable because people like Adam Clarke are hugely knowledgeable about these works, where they came from, and all the different types of Bibles.
Sorry,
so
Ralph, Adam Clarke is the guy that wrote about every single verse in the Bible, didn't he? Basically,
yeah, he made a concordance of the Bible. So he made a commentary on virtually every single verse. I mean, it's a vast undertaking. But in order to get there, he's not reading just one Bible; he's reading 10 or 15. Making comparisons between the verses because they're all different in the different Bibles. So he'll go through the Greek ones, he'll go through the Syriac ones, the Coptic ones. And so he says of Joseph Barsabbas, Joseph Barsabbas is called Barnabas in many manuscripts. Acts 1:23. So yeah, thanks Adam Clarke. He's been through all of these works and he's seen this discrepancy. And then he says Joseph Barnabas is also called Barsabbas in the Coptic Gospels. So, yeah, there's a confusion between these names, between Barsabbas and Barnabas, and there's probably a good reason for that, but we won't go into that at the minute. But anyway, so the two contenders for this new position of disciple were Joseph Barnabas and Matthias Barnabas. Almost like they were two brothers having the same surname, same title. And that's interesting because we get a Joseph and a Matthias. Now, who was the brother of Josephus Flavius? He was Matthias. So what I'm sort of indicating here is that, because it would fit his position very, very well if Saul was Josephus and he wants to become the new apostle, the new disciple, like Saul would have done, because Saul had to go later and say, well, I'm the apostle to the Gentiles because you won't let me become a proper disciple. He would be wanting to become one of the disciples. And so, yes, the Saul character and the Josephus character would have put their names forward for the position of disciple. And so this election, looking at it critically, looks as if it was between Josephus Flavius and his brother Matthias for the position of new apostle or new disciple. But of course, it was Matthias that won this competition, this election. And the Josephus character lost. And so you can imagine him being highly pissed off with this, that he's just been rejected by the disciples, and setting up his own church in response to this, which is exactly what Saul does. He sets up his own church, the Church of Saul, which is now preaching to the Gentiles, because he becomes pro-Roman and sets up he becomes the apostle to the Gentiles in competition to the Nazarene Church of Jesus and James. It's exactly what he does, and that's exactly what would have happened if he had been, a part of this election. And his church, of course, became much more powerful than the Nazarene Church of Jesus and James. And he eventually won by inventing a new church that became more popular than the Nazarene Church. It explains quite a lot.
Yeah.
And the Barsabbas name is significant because Barsabbas means the son of the star, with Sabbas coming from the Egyptian, Sabah meaning star. It still means star in the English. A Sabaean is a star worshipper. And so he was called Barsabbas, the son of a star. But of course, that's a famous name in the circles because Bar Kokhba, from the later uprising in the 2nd century, was also called the son of the star, Bar Kokhba. So he's adopting a sort of very special aristocratic royal title of a savior, the son of the star, Barsabbas. It fits. So this election of the new disciple, which doesn't really fit anything because we don't know who these characters were who went for this election, suddenly becomes explainable. Why don't we know who these people were that went into this election, this important post, of the new disciple? Well, now we know. The guy who was going there for it was Saul Josephus and his brother, and he lost. So yes, this is the important thing about this conflation. So we have a conflation. We have two very similar characters, and both of these characters are missing from the historical record, and so we conflate them because they seem very similar. And the problem then becomes, does this make sense in the wider context of the Gospels? We can conflate these two characters, and that will have no effect whatsoever, perhaps, on the story. And therefore, it's not a very satisfactory conflation. However, if this conflation starts to explain things, then we can be much more sure that it's a true explanation. And yes, this does start to explain things, as we've just seen, the election of a new disciple. But it goes on. The main one, I think, is what I've just touched on very, very lightly, with why Saul was chasing people around Galilee. So we have these texts from the New Testament. From the New Testament, from Acts of the Apostles, where Saul is chasing around they would have been the Nazarene Jews. People say they were Christians. They wouldn't have been Christians. He was chasing the Nazarene around Galilee and chasing Jesus around Galilee. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he was... what does he say about them? Saul made havoc of the church, entering into every house and committing them to prison. Acts 8:3. I, Saul, this is the I section of Acts where he's talking about himself. I persecuted them unto death, binding and delivering men and women into prisons. Acts 22:4. How was a tent maker arresting people and putting them in prison? Under what authority was he doing so? How was he chasing Jesus around Galilee? It makes no sense. Nobody has ever explained from the classical view of the Gospels how this is possible. And of course, it does become possible if Saul is Josephus, because Josephus was the army commander in command of Galilee. He was appointed by the Jerusalem authorities in about AD 65-ish, something of that nature, as the army commander in command of Galilee. And his goal at that time was to chase a guy called Jesus around Galilee. That's what he was doing. And the guy he was chasing around Galilee was called Jesus Gamaliel, the famous guy that I equate with a biblical Jesus, because, well, this is one reason that I conflate those two. So the conflation of Saul and Josephus explains how Saul was arresting these people and putting them in jail, because he was the policeman, the chief of police, effectively, in command of Galilee. But that only works if he was Josephus Flavius. That doesn't work if he was a tent maker called Saul. So they have to be conflated, otherwise that makes no sense whatsoever. It explains, well, we've sort of been through this already, but it explains why governors came to see Saul in prison. We've had a look at this. Festus came to see him, Acts 26:24. Felix came to him and wanted a bribe, Acts 24:26. Agrippa the second of Berenike came to see him in prison, and then he's sent to Nero. Why would a tent maker be fated by all of these governors of Judea and then be sent to Nero? Makes no sense. But if he was Josephus Flavius, who was clearly aristocratic, he says so. He says he was descended from the royal family, the Herodian, I can't remember. No, the Hasmonean, I think, royal family. Then, of course, he would have been seen by all of these procurators and governors of Judea. So again, we're explaining things which were inexplicable before. It makes much more sense if he was Josephus Flavius. And it explains why he was called a tent maker. So we have this. They keep doing this. It's common in all of the Bible, the Old Testament and New Testament, where they have these important people and they try to make them out to be poor artisans or shepherds or whatever. You know, most of the patriarchs in the Old Testament are reduced to being shepherds of a few moth-eaten sheep. When Abraham had an army that had 328 army commanders. So if each commander was a centurion, then he had a standing army of 30,000 people. And
Wow.
yet they still try and make out that the guy was a shepherd. Yeah, show me any shepherd, on a Welsh hill somewhere that has a standing army of 30,000 people. Clearly the guy was not a shepherd of sheep. And, we've sort of been through this before, but clearly he was a Hyksos shepherd king, a shepherd pharaoh, who were also called shepherds, but would have had a standing army of 30,000 men. It makes much more sense of the story. But they do the same to Jesus. They make him out to be a carpenter when he wasn't. He was a tekton. And a tekton is effectively, it's a Freemason in the Greek, which explains the raising of Lazarus, which is a third-degree initiation into Masonry. And they do the same with Saul, who they call a tent maker, which doesn't, as we've just seen, it doesn't coincide with the rest of the story about Saul being important and having all of these kings and governors come to see him when he was in jail. So what is it meaning? Well, he sort of was a tent maker, but it's a very, very poor translation. What he was a Sukot maker. A Sukot maker for the festival of Sukots within Judaism, where they all make tents. And the tent is supposed to be a tabernacle, so it's a replication of the tabernacle from the Exodus story. And so they have this festival, everybody makes a little tent, and they all stay in their tent for 2 or 3 nights over the festival period. And Queen Helena of Edessa Adiabene had the biggest Sukot in the whole of the Levant, all of Judea. And so it's quite clear that Saul was not just an ordinary artisan tent maker. He was a Sukot maker for Queen Helena because he was linked to this royal family, and he was an important member of that royal family, which is why people came to see him when he was in jail. Like, Agrippa II and Berenike, who came to see him in jail because he was linked to the Edessan royal family. What does Acts say about it? Acts says, because he was, this is talking about Saul, because he was of the same craft as this man, he stayed with them, for by their occupation they were tent makers. No, they weren't. They were Sukot makers. These were important people in the royal family, and Queen Helena had the largest Sukot in Judea. And this makes sense of, it makes sense of his other link to the Edessan royal family. So there was a famine in Judea, and famine relief money was sent by Queen Helena of Adiabene Edessa. We have that from Josephus. And it was also sent by Agabus, the unknown Agabus within Acts of the Apostles. And it says in Acts of the Apostles, it says, one named Agabus prophesied that there would be a great famine throughout the whole world, which came to the pass in the days of Claudius Caesar. That's up to about AD 53 or 54, I think it is. The disciples determined to send famine relief to the brothers in Judea and sent it by the hands of Saul and Barnabas. Now there's a problem, because this famine relief money was sent by Queen Helena of Edessa. And now from Acts of the Apostles, this same famine relief money is being sent by Agabus, who is clearly King Abgarus, the king of Edessa. It's the same relief money, it's the same event. It's just been slightly covered up. because they don't want you to know anything about Edessa. So they've changed his name slightly. But the important thing is that this money was sent to Jerusalem from Edessa by Saul and Barnabas, the two people who used to go across the Mediterranean on those evangelical tours. Now that's interesting because it's demonstrating that Saul was an ambassador of Edessa. He had to be taking this famine relief money down there. He had to be an Edessan ambassador.
Mm.
And now we see two things. He was the Sukot Maker for Queen Helena, and now he's taking the famine relief money from Queen Helena, which was taken down to Jerusalem. He must have been a prince and an ambassador of the Edessan royal family. That's why kings and governors came to see him when he was in prison. That's why they asked for bribes from him, because he was aristocratic. He was wealthy. He had money.
Mm.
And it also explains how Josephus was taking down the three leaders of the Jewish revolt from the cross. Now, I think we've been through this before once, haven't we?
Yeah, we have, yeah.
Yeah. So very, very briefly, Josephus Flavius has an identical sort of crucifixion scene where he takes the leader of the Jewish revolt down from the cross. Now, that sort of only works if we have a much later gospel date, the chronological chasm. It doesn't work if it was in the AD 30s. It only works if it was in AD 70. And the thing about this conflation between Saul and Josephus is that it requires a later date for the gospel events, because Josephus was only born in AD 37. And so all of the dates within the gospel period that mention a Saul have to be after sort of AD 52, when he became a man, or AD 51 when he became a man. And that's something when I started this conflation, and I wrote about it back in 1996, something like that, 97, long time ago. So I put forward this theory, and it wasn't fully explained at that time, but I just knew that it had to be correct. So I put it out there anyway for everyone to see and comment on. And the main comment that always came back is, can't be the same person because Saul was born in AD 10. To which my answer is, where does it say that? Oh, well, he has to be born in AD 10 in order to go on his evangelical tours in the AD 50s. No, he doesn't.
No.
Saul became a man when he was 14, which would have been in AD 51, and he was a man at that point. And so, of course, as a man, he could go across the Mediterranean on these evangelical tours with his older brother, who I think Barnabas was his older brother. That's exactly what would happen. And I think I've already explained that, this is what we get if you get Mormons knocking on your door. You don't get a couple of old geezers, you get a couple of youngsters. And so the late birth date of Josephus does not detract from this theory at all. It reinforces it in many respects. It explains many things that were not explainable before. And yeah, I suppose in a way it explains who Joseph of Arimathea was. Again, we've been through this before, so I won't belabor it. If it was Josephus Flavius who was taking the Jesus character down from the cross, as he explains in his Vita or Life, then Joseph of Arimathea must be Josephus Flavius. And again, this makes sense because Joseph of Arimathea and Josephus was the son of Matthias, Joseph ben Matthias. They virtually have the same name, and now it explains who this Joseph of Arimathea guy was, taking him down from the cross. And again, this only works if we have a later date for the gospel story. So it only works in a way if the Saul character is the Josephus character, because that allows for this later date for the Gospels. And we also get explanations within Arthurian legend. Now, lots of people don't like me using Arthurian legend as evidence, but remember, these stories came back from the Crusades, from people who had just been to Edessa, the same place we keep talking about. The first crusade went to Edessa, was the first city to be liberated from Muslim control. And so these stories came back from the Near East. And from that, they devised these stories about this King Arthur guy. But a lot of the stories they're writing about were about Joseph of Arimathea.
He was the main hero of the stories, wasn't he?
In many respects, he was the main hero. And you have to wonder why Joseph of Arimathea, because he's first century from the Near East. What's that to do with Arthurian history? But within Arthurian, so for many respects, we do find valuable historic information or biblical information within the Arthurian legend, because it's talking about Joseph of Arimathea. But one of the things it says about Joseph, I should say, of Arimathea, was the odd suggestion that he was a knight working for Vespasian and had been doing so for 7 years. Now, how is that possible? Joseph of Arimathea is supposed to be this AD 30s character, and he wasn't supposed to be pro-Roman necessarily, you know. He was taking Jesus down from the cross. Suddenly we get this idea that Joseph of Arimathea was a knight working for Vespasian. Now, who was the knight working for Vespasian who was called Josephus? It was Josephus Flavius. He had been working for the Romans all halfway during the Jewish revolt, and I think he was working as a spy for Rome before the Jewish revolt. So yes, he had been working for Emperor Vespasian for 7 years, just as Arthurian history says. And again, this is peculiar, it's slightly heretical, that, you know, this hero of the biblical story is now Josephus Flavius, which no Christian would admit to, because Josephus Flavius is such a slippery, slimy character that you would not want him associated in any way with your gospel story. You know, he's a traitor to the Jews. I call him the Quicksilver Quilled Quisling, because he changed sides exactly the same as Saul did and went over to the Romans. So yeah, that all starts to make sense as well, if we know that Saul was Josephus. And it shifts the timeline. We've had a look at that. I think we discussed this before, didn't we? The shift in the time.
Yeah.
It sort of explains why we get this character called Saulus going to Greece to see Nero. Now, this comes from the works of Josephus, because within the works of Josephus, of course, we get no mention of the Jesus character, apart from the Testimonium Flavium, which is discredited as being an addition to the text. And we get no mention of Saul. So all of these important characters that come to us from the gospel story are missing from the works of Josephus for no good reason. He would have known about these people.
Sorry to interject, Ralph, but we do get a mention of a character called Saul of Tarsus. Is that correct in Josephus's works?
No, that's from Acts of the Apostles.
No, apologies.
Yeah, I don't think that's in the works of Josephus. Unless I'm mistaken, I'm pretty sure that Saul doesn't appear there. The only time we get a mention in the works of Josephus is of Saulus, who goes to Greece to see Nero. This would have been in the mid AD 60s, early AD 60s.
He was described as a kinsman of Agrippa. Is that correct?
Yes, I think he was. Can't remember, but yes, I think he was. And the question then becomes, if Saul was Josephus, why is he suddenly being called Saul within the works of Josephus instead of first person I or something? Or even third person, because sometimes he uses the third person, says Josephus did this, Josephus did that. So why is he suddenly being called Saul if this was a reference to Saul? Well, I think that Josephus Flavius, after he went to Rome to see Nero, became a spy working for the Romans. It would suit his character, and it would suit the fact that when he surrendered to Rome at Jotapata during the Jewish revolt, Vespasian was expecting him to come to him. Why was Vespasian expecting Josephus as an army commander, a Jewish army commander, to come to him and surrender to him? It was as if he knew Josephus Flavius rather well already and had expectations of him, as if they'd already had discussions about this beforehand. Well, if he was a spy working for Rome, then perhaps they had. Because what Rome wanted, of course, because they knew there was trouble brewing in the East. They didn't. The East was always a hotbed for revolts, and what they wanted was eyes on the ground in Judea to tell them what was going on, because they had no clue about the Jewish religion, the Jewish people, and their desires and their intents, and they needed ears and eyes on the ground in Judea. Who better to provide that than Josephus Flavius, aka Saul? And that's what I think he was doing ever since he went to Rome, which would have been AD 62ish, 63ish, something like that. I think he had been working for Nero. But of course, Nero wouldn't bother with a spy. He would delegate that to someone else, and he probably delegated it to Vespasian as being a trusted commander, because Vespasian had already been the army commander who had invaded Britain back in AD 43. So he was always already a trusted commander within the Roman Empire. And of course, when Saulus went to Greece to see Nero, Vespasian was there as well. And we know this because Vespasian almost got executed for falling asleep during one of Nero's plays that he put on. He liked to put on these plays and fiddle for the crowd. And dear old Vespasian, who wasn't into politics at all, fell asleep and got into severe trouble for it. But through that little event, we know that Vespasian was in Greece at the time when Saulus went to Greece. And so I think that this conflated Saul Josephus character went to Greece to tell them about events in Judea, the problems that were brewing, because everyone knew there was a revolt coming, something was happening over in the eastern provinces, and to appraise Vespasian of all of the happenings in Judea. It makes sense. And of course, Josephus, when he was writing this story in later years, because he didn't write about this until AD 72, couldn't really say that he himself had gone to see Vespasian in Greece, because he was supposed to be working for the Jewish authorities at that time. I mean, his character is bad enough without saying, I was a spy for Rome and I'd just been to Greece to go and see Vespasian. And so I think what he did at that point is he just used his alter ego and said, oh, it was Saul that went over there. And again, this explains something that has not been readily explained previously. If you conflate Saul with Josephus. And yeah, I think that's about it, really. We've been through most of the points.
Okay. I believe I'm right in saying that Josephus and Saul were both Pharisees who were against circumcision. Is that correct?
Yes. Oh,
Because
I didn't
that was
write.
quite a radical position to take at the time, wasn't it?
It was. Now, Saul was against it. We know that because there is a section in the epistles where he says, why do these people want to be circumcised? If they like circumcision that much, they might as well cut their penis off and have done with it. So clearly Saul was against circumcision. Now, we don't get a unequivocal statement by Josephus Flavius, but there is a section I seem to remember where he's talking about circumcision, and the way he talks about it indicates that he did not approve of circumcision. And plus he was a Roman citizen. That, you know, as a Roman, you don't abide by these Jewish habits. And so he didn't have the long hair, and he wouldn't, unless he had been done as a child and had no choice about it, he wouldn't be circumcised. But even if he was circumcised, you know, you can still be against it, even if your parents have done it to you. And I get the impression as a Roman citizen, he was against circumcision. He was certainly against castration. We were talking about castration before.
The galleys.
The galleys, that Jesus was a galley and Jesus would have been castrated. And that's why Jesus asks for his disciples to get themselves castrated. Josephus was certainly against that, because he is, I would say, mocking when he describes the galley and how they dress up as women. He's certainly not approving of that. So yes, there's another similarity between the two. They would have been both against circumcision.
Is it true that the translator of Josephus's works, William Whiston, wrote that Josephus and Saul had a very similar writing style?
Yes. Well, not only that, there are many extracts from the works of Josephus that have found themselves into Acts of the Apostles, in particular. So that is why historians, theologians say that the Gospels were not written until the AD 70s, which doesn't actually make a great deal of sense. So they have this story of events from the AD 30s by a highly literate people. I mean, the Jews wrote about everything. And yet we have to have this 40-year period of oral transmission because they couldn't write about it for some reason. They blame it on, Jesus being a carpenter or something. But of course, he was called a king on numerous occasions. And we've just seen how Saul was obviously aristocratic. Otherwise, these kings and governors wouldn't have come to see him when he was in prison. So clearly, they were not artisans, and they could have afforded scribes, or even written themselves, because they would have been literate. They could have written this story down in the AD 30s, but they didn't. And according to all of the theologians and historians, they only had oral transmission of all of these texts for 40 years before they were written down in the AD 70s. Why do they say that? Well, it's because there's so much work, so much material from the works of Josephus in there. And that's a problem, because how can you have Gospels from the AD 30s with loads of material from Josephus Flavius in it? And so they have to say that they weren't written down until the AD 70s. But it's far easier to say, well, these events actually took place in the AD 60s, and the Jesus character wasn't executed. He wasn't crucified until AD 70. And so they were writing about it immediately after these events had actually happened. So again, it makes sense, more sense of the history as we know it, to say that Saul was Josephus and these events happened in the AD 60s.
I saw a really good lecture the other night on YouTube by a guy called Dr. Henry Abramson. I don't know if you've come across the name before.
Yes. He's got a few videos out. Yes.
Yeah, he stated that a lot of the events in Josephus's biography, Vita, are either plagiarized accounts or completely fabricated. So would that surprise you at all? Would you concur with that?
Well, I don't know who they would be plagiarized from, because I don't recognize them as coming necessarily from other characters. So he would have to clarify who Josephus is supposed to be plagiarizing, because he's mainly talking about the events of the Jewish revolt. Now, we don't really have any other authors of the Jewish revolt. The only one that we did have was the History of the Kings by Justus of Tiberias, who Josephus Flavius hates. I mean, he has page after page of accusation against Justus of Tiberias, because he was writing about this same material. And of course, Josephus says he was lying, it was all untruths, you know. And unfortunately, of course, that text has gone. We don't have it, presumably because after the Jewish revolt, Josephus destroyed it. And so we don't have it anymore. So we don't know what was being said by this guy, and we don't know what was being said by anyone else, really, because it was Josephus who wrote the history of the Jewish revolt. So I don't know who he could be plagiarizing. So yeah, without clarification from Abramson, I don't really know what he's talking about there.
Okay. He was pretty scathing of Josephus in general, though, and
oh yes, I mean Josephus was a liar. I mean, he was a liar the same as Saul was called a liar. It was fabricated from the point of view that everything had a Roman slant on it, and so you have to de-Romify everything he says, because he was writing for Roman patrons. His books were paid for by Vespasian. And so, of course, everything had to have a Roman slant to it. And he was Roman himself, and he was working for Rome. So he was pro-Roman. And so everything has this bias of Rome all the way through it. And you have to allow for that in anything that Josephus says or doesn't say, because we have many lacuna, many gaps that Josephus leaves out if they don't suit his bias, his particular agenda. I think we've been through before where he's talking about the battle with Herod Antipas. Did we go through that one? I can't remember. About John the Baptist.
I don't think we have, actually.
Oh, okay. Well, that's an interesting one if we've not been through that, because it shows many things. So we have this story of John the Baptist, who was complaining about a marriage. Now, that marriage was that Herod Antipas, who was a son of King Herod, so this would have been the AD 30s, early AD 30s, had married, what was she called? Pharsalus, who was the daughter of King Aretas of Petra, the famous Rose City. So his daughter married Herod Antipas, who was the tetrarch of Judea. But then Antipas got bored with her or whatever, and sent her back home again, divorced her and sent her back home, and married Herodias, and who had the famous daughter Salome, who brought the head of John the Baptist on a platter, you know, that one. And so he marries Herodias. Now, as John said, John the Baptist, that marriage was not lawful. Herodias was his niece, or niece one removed. What do you call it from a half niece, if that's a thing. And also there was a transgression in the law with divorcing one wife and marrying the next one. And so John stood up and said that that marriage is not lawful. And for that, he got his head cut off. And it was taken on a platter to wherever he was, Jerusalem, presumably. So because of this, and we get this from two works, well, three works, because we get the biblical description, of course, which shows that the biblical texts are based on history. But we get this also from Josephus, who says that King Aretas was upset by this because his daughter had just been spurned and sent home. And so he sent an army to go and punish Antipas. And they, according to Josephus, they were joined by some fugitives from Syria and defeated Herod Antipas. So they had this big battle somewhere in Judea. And they all went home happy because Antipas had been defeated. And you think, well, hold on a minute. This is so typical of Josephus, leaving out things that are controversial. And so he calls these people fugitives from Syria. Yeah, Josephus, you know who these people are, so why are you not telling us who they are? And I didn't know about this for many years until I went out to Syria and started reading the Syrian historians like Moses of Corine. And suddenly you find the same story. Exactly the same story. So now we've got three versions of the same story. And Moses of Corine, because he's a Syriac, he was cut off from the rest of Western civilization by, the Iron Curtain of Islam. And so he writes a different story from a Syriac sort of Armenian perspective. And he says exactly the same story. Antipas was upset and he sends an army, and his army was joined by the Edessan army of King Abgarus of Edessa, and they defeat Herod Antipas.
Wow.
So now we have the full story. The fugitives that Josephus will not tell us about are the Edessan army who came from northern Syria and joined in with King Aretas to defeat the Tetrarch. And this is interesting in so many respects, because it shows us that Josephus is not telling us the full story, that we cannot get the full story unless we have another version of it, really, or we have to guesstimate what the true story is. And it also shows that John the Baptist, why were the Edessans upset about this? It wasn't their daughter being sent home. So what were the Edessans upset about, that they would send an army down into Judea? It has to be the beheading of John the Baptist. That's the only real key thing that they could be upset by, which rather shows that John the Baptist must have been linked to the Edessan royal family. And we've already seen that Saul Josephus was the ambassador of Edessa, taking the famine relief money down into Judea. Now we see that John the Baptist must have been linked in some fashion to the Edessan monarchy. And so the Edessan monarchy suddenly becomes central to the gospel story. But only if we have someone other than Josephus telling us the story, because he's not going to tell us the full story, because Rome didn't want us to know that full story, because Rome wanted Edessa deleted from history. And that's what Josephus did for his Roman patron.
One or two of your critics, I know, have said before that Moses of Corine is not the most reliable source. Was he 4th century, 3rd century?
I think as high as 6th century.
Well, really? Wow.
Yep.
Okay. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that at all.
We have to work with what we've got. We can't invent new chroniclers because we don't have them. And so we have to work with the information we have. But when we look at things like this story about Aretas and his armies, it is corroborating what Moses of Corine says, because it's quite obvious that Moses of Corine has the same story plus additional bits of information. And so we know that what he's saying is basically true. I mean, he tells us about the Edessan monarchy for a start, which Josephus does not whatsoever. And so, yeah, he's giving us information that we don't know otherwise, filling in the gaps, and those gaps sort of make sense. So to throw out Moses of Corine would be throwing out the baby with the bathwater. It would be crazy. You have to take into account everyone's bias, of course. Moses of Corine was not working in a vacuum. He was working probably at that time in Assyria. He would have been working under some sort of Persian type control. And he was a Christian, so you've got a Christian bias in there somewhere. But working through all of those biases, I see no reason for rejecting Moses of Corine, except for the fact that he upsets the biblical story. And so if you're a fundamentalist Christian, and some of these critics I think are secretly Christian or something, I don't know why, because they have an irrational opposition to what I'm saying, then of course you would want to denigrate Moses of Corine, because he's saying something that upsets the Christian story quite drastically in places.
Okay, thanks, Ralph. This has been absolutely fascinating. I've really enjoyed this one. Please like, share, subscribe. Look out for our many names of Jesus. The next 2 parts are coming up over the next few days. Thanks for watching, everyone. Thank you very much, Ralph, as always. We'll see you again. Cheers.